So today we are joined by Daniel Sznycer, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Oklahoma State University. His talk today is titled Value, Computation in Humans. So thank you for joining us, Daniel, and welcome to Beck. We're all very glad you could join us today.
Thanks for the invitation, Brian. It's great to be here, see old faces and new faces. And I'm a little bit under the weather, so excuse my voice and my sluggishness. Let me share the screen and put it in. Can you see the slide?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. All right, thanks again. And I will talk about value, human values, and how the brain computes values. So we have a lot of folk knowledge about how vision works. We know, for example, that we open our eyes and we see the world out there. But that's not a scientific theory of vision. It's taking many decades to many teams to dissect vision in the brain. And similarly, I want to argue that we have intuitions, very strong intuitions about how we value things and the value of things, the value of foods, the value of tools, the value of raw materials, fuel, social partners, the value of positive things and also the value of negative things, things such as injuries, diseases, the value of rivals, enemies, and so on. But these intuitions do not themselves constitute a theory of how the brain computes value, of course. And so that's my interest and what I'd like to, me and other people have been working on. I ask myself, how do humans value the things that they value? And what is the value to begin with that the brain would have evolved to represent it and compute it? There's been quite a bit of work, descriptive and taxonomical, on human values in sociology and social psychology, cultural psychology. And these thinkers and researchers have cataloged a number of values that people hold broadly around the world or in broad cultural regions. Things such as security, benevolence, true friendship, survival, self-expression, individualism, collectivism, and so on. But in addition to these abstractions, notice that there's a vast number of specific things and vastly different things that people value, mundane, banal, day-to-day, completely normal things, such as water, rice, meat, potatoes, cat, obsidian, shelter, rituals, the pilgrimage of Compostela, double entry bookkeeping institutions, money, spectroscopy techniques, sleeping, whispering when the baby is getting asleep, whiskey, sleeping, mates, friends, allies, direct routes, you name it. So the list goes on pretty much ad infinitum. And so how the brain computes these things, the value of these things. So a theory of human values needs to account not only for these aspirational big abstractions, these big V values in the human value encyclopedia, but also the value of water, honey, and so on. It needs to account for all of these values. It needs to account also for the values held by all of the people, by the many people, and by the few, all of the values. And so one of my goals in my career is to try to come up with something that is a theory of the machinery that computes value, such that you feed the machinery the cues of anything and everything that humans in principle can value or disvalue, positively or negatively, and then the theory and the machine will give you the values that humans actually impute to those things. Okay, so here's a very minimalist theory of value. What is value? The proposal is that things, organisms, events, states of affairs afford positive, neutral, or negative long-run effects on the replicative probability of the focal individual's genes. things are roughly 4 positive or negative effects on fitness. And at the most general levels, values are internal estimates, or more minimally, reflections or indices of those effects. And values are useful because they can be accessed. Values are for doing. They're not just, the goal here, by evolutionary biological theory, value is that we don't compute value in order to echo cosmos just for the sake of knowing, or to from the standpoint of the cosmos, but rather values are for doing. Self-centered or gene-centered theory of values. Values are useful. They can be accessed by regulatory mechanisms to steer decision, physiology, and behavior in the right direction. So an apple affords you, on average, positive effects on your fitness. And because that is echoed in the architecture, internal architecture that computes values, then you approach the apple. And likewise with a friend. Reciprocally, because a lion affords negative fitness effects, that's reflected internally in the architecture that computes values, you avoid the lion, you avoid the foe, and so on. Okay, so the first part of the talk, I will talk about social emotions and how they recalibrate social valuations held by self and others. Here's social valuation. And in the second part of the talk, I will talk about values more broadly, social, but also non-social. Okay, let me minimize this thing here. Okay. So, okay. Shame. My dissertation work has been on the emotion of shame, and the theory here advanced by others before me, Dan here and others, or we can have a chat with Dan, but similar differences, but similarities. But anyway, that shame, there's an adaptive problem in shame, and there's you have an adaptive problem if you're a human, and the problem is that negative information about yourself, about actions, for example, if you steal, or traits, for example, if you're lazy, if that negative information is discovered by other people, that leads them to place less value on your welfare, and that behaviorally, that means that they're going to be less inclined to help you and more inclined to take self-beneficial actions that will be to your detriment, and therefore you're in trouble. And therefore, we expect that natural selection may have crafted a machine whose function is to minimize the likelihood and cost of being devalued by other people. And so in this theory, the trigger of shame is any negative information about yourself which spreads into the community, in reality or in prospect, potentially. And we expect that the shame system might be finally crafted and engineered to fit, to tamper with, and to block and to minimize the devaluative threat from others. And therefore, it should be designed like a key to fit the lock, and the lock here is the social evaluative psychology of others. Okay, and if you read the literature on shame from this theoretical perspective, you can see that many of the things that people do when they feel shame are things that are well suited to defeat the threat of being devalued by others. So when we feel shame, we hide. And that's maybe bad from the perspective of the emotion of shame is highly moralized. So other non-evolutionary theories of shame, they blame shame as an emotion that is ugly and malfunctional, dysfunctional, or maladaptive, because people do all sorts of nasty things when they feel shame. They hide, they destroy incriminating evidence, they deploy violence, killing, honor killings, all sorts of things. And those things are bad from the standpoint of society, but they might be good for the individual himself or herself, pressed as he or she is to defeat the threat of being devalued. So we hide, we destroy evidence, we display submission, and there's evidence by Keltner, for example, that produces a mollifying response from audiences if you show submission and appeasement. You blame others, you may shift the blame to others, you may increase the cooperation, increases in cortisol, and so on. Okay, so So that's a minimalist theory of shame. And then on the social valuation side, there's many things to say about social valuation, but the Twitter length, the summary of that is that it's really important to be valued by others in the human social ecology. We live or die, we rise or fall to a great extent, depending on the degree to which other people value us or not. If they value you and they esteem you and respect you, you thrive. If they don't, if they shun you or ostracize you, they will exploit you and they will maybe kill you. So that's not good. So being valued by others is a key resource in the human social ecology, and therefore we expect this to be factored into social decision making, and the shame system may take this into account. So to give a cartoon example of how this might work, here's the self and the other. And there's work by various people suggesting that the mind is equipped with machinery for computing the value of other people to the self, how much weight you will attach to the welfare of other people relative to your own welfare based on the actions of other people and the personal characteristics of other people. So other people will value you or will value you more or less depending on your actions and your characteristics. You help them, you harm them, you are competent, you are hardworking, or you're lazy, and so on. And so to the extent that you have more of these things and that other people learn about these things, they will be more inclined to help you and less inclined to exploit you. And reciprocally, if they learn negative things about you, they will value you less with the attendant costs of reduced help and more exploitation. So here there's this guy, he's a guest at a host. There's a host, his friend, he's throwing a party, and there's this delicious cake. This guy doesn't know if he wants some of the cake. He doesn't know if he should wait for the host to cut the cake or help himself to the cake. Okay, what should I do? I don't know. Well, the proposal is that in deciding what to do, he should consider not only the direct payoff of taking the action that he wants to take, grabbing some of the cake, but also the change in other people's valuation that will occur if he took an action that other people might disvalue. So he likes the cake, but he dislikes the host's disapproval that would happen if he ate the cake, he thinks. And so he's gonna go ahead here and help himself to the cake. Okay. Now consider this slightly different situation where this is the host's daughter's wedding cake. Now he likes the cake just as much, but he thinks the host would really hate it if he ate the cake. So now he's not going to eat the cake. And notice that this is the only change here. This is the same. Can you see the cursor here? So here, okay. Here's the same payoff, but this changed. And so that was enough to change his decision. And so the hypothesis I've been working on is that the anticipatory feeling of shame that you feel ahead of taking any action. So you don't have to take any disgraceful action yet. You're considering a menu of possible actions that you might want to take, some of which might be self-beneficial, but other detrimental. And each might have some felt anticipatory shame. And the hypothesis is that this felt anticipatory shame is an internal signal that is an estimation of just how much devaluation you will get from others, maybe weighted by the probability of detection that you will incur if you take a given action X that other people disfavor, that they devalue by a given amount. So here's Mencken famously saying that conscience is the inner voice that warns us that someone might be looking. It's kind of that theory quantitatively, and it's that theory. So that gives us a theory of sub-functions that the shame system might have if it is to defeat the threat of being devalued by others. One is prospective function. In prospect, before you take any disgraceful action, the shame system should deter courses of action where the cost of devaluation exceeds the benefit of the act. The cost outweighs the benefit of the act, then don't take the action. And the shame system should guide you toward not taking the action. So you might eat the cake, but not the wedding cake. In addition, in prospect, the shame system should help you limit the extent to which other people learn about and spread potentially damaging information. So you might seek privacy, you might engage and take the act but in private, for example, or you might destroy incriminating evidence. And in retrospect, if you have taken the action and other people have devalued you, if devaluation occurs, then the system should mobilize the individual to minimize the costs. So you might try to repair the relationship, appease, cooperate, or run away, hide, avoid physical damage. Okay, so consider this prospective function of deterring you from taking actions that are too costly in terms of devaluation. The one specific prediction that you can derive from this theory is that for each candidate disgraceful action that you're considering, for example, stealing candy or stealing pizza or money or whatever, for each candidate action, the anticipatory feeling of shame needs to be, on the one hand, intense enough to avoid devaluation, but not so intense that the cost of foregone benefit exceeds the cost of devaluation. There's such a thing as excessive shame, and if you're too timid, you are for sure avoiding the devaluation, but also you're foregoing benefits, and that's not good. But it's also not good to be insufficiently shameful. So it's a theory of just right, like Goldilocks. So this reminds me of Greek mythology, and it also reminds me of Goldilocks. It has to be just right. The internal intensity of anticipatory shame needs to be calibrated just right to the local ecology of devaluation. So the prediction here is that the shame system should, for each candidate potential action that you might take, forecast the precise magnitude of devaluation that others will deploy against you accurately, and deliver a signal of anticipatory felt shame that is proportional to this forecast. There's quite a bit of theory on how affective forecasting is erroneous and inaccurate, but here in this theory, the theory is that at least to some interesting extent, affective forecasting should be accurate to the fitness costs of being devalued. Okay, so in plain English, this means that if there's more devaluation in the audience for a given action X, that will predict more anticipatory shame in self if you yourself are planning to take action X, for example. So in order to test this prediction, I created a number of brief hypothetical situations in which you are the subject in this experiment, and imagine that you read these situations. You're not very smart, you look 10 years older than you are, do a bad job taking care of your children. And for each of these negative things, I ask you, imagine this is true of you, and how much shame would you feel if this were true of you? And that's a measure of anticipatory shame. And in a between subjects design, I ask a different group of participants, I show them the same situations, but now they're from the perspective of an audience where this is true not of themselves, but of someone else. So he is not very smart, so on, match one by one. And I ask subjects for each of these things, how negatively would you view this other person if these things were true of them? And that's a measure of social devaluation, simple measure of devaluation. Okay, so is it the case that the anticipatory signal of shame tracks the magnitude of audience devaluation? The answer is yes. It appears that it's the case. So these are United States data, and each of these dots represent, so each of these dots are one hypothetical situation. And in each case, you have the audience devaluation here on the x-axis and the individual reported, shame reported by the individual on the y-axis. And you see a strong positive relationship between shaming the individual and audience devaluation. The more the audience devalues a given trait or action, the more anticipatory shame the subject reports. And this has been replicated in India and in Israel. Okay, and in addition to this, there's a number of ancillary findings here. Shame intensities track not only within a given country the corresponding devaluation of the audience, but also if you correlate the shame expressed by Americans against the devaluation expressed by Indians or Israelis, you find positive correlations everywhere. So it's like shame somehow knows the values held by foreign audiences. It's specifically shame and not any all negatively valenced emotion that tracks audience evaluation. If in a regression you put shame and also sadness ratings and anxiety ratings, it's shame but not the other negative emotions that is tracking audience evaluation. And also shame is specifically tuned to the values of local audiences. So in additional studies, we created situations where we decouple the values held by local and foreign audiences, and we show that when, for some values, when local and foreign audiences are discoordinated in the things that they value, then the shame of people track the values held by local audiences, but not foreign audiences, as it should be, because the shame system should track the values held by those who will affect your welfare if you screw up and other people find out. And as a bonus, the fact here that for many actions, shame also tracks the values of foreign audiences suggests that there might be a number of actions or some elements in the grammar of valuations that are universal or shared across cultures. Okay. So that's evidence suggesting or consistent with the idea that shame is a system designed to defeat the theory of devaluation, and that's part of human nature. But there's an alternative theory, namely that these commonalities may have been learned from a common culture shared across those three countries. After all, America, Israel, and India are weird or weirdish. They are modern industrial cultures in cultural and commercial and informational contact. And so can we tease this hypothesis apart? So in order to find out, my collaborators and I have conducted work in 15 traditional small-scale societies scattered around the world, many of them off the grid, some of them forager ecology, small-scale, no electricity, no internet, and so on. And we find in this study that in each of the 15 societies that we evaluated, the method is the same. There's a smaller number of situations, but it's pretty much the same method. And in each of these 15 societies, we find massive whooping effects of shame tracking devaluation. Not only locally in each of these 15 societies, but also it is the case that in each of the 15 set of shame scores tracks the devaluation reported by each of the other 14 small-scale societies. So to give you a visual example of this, if you plot the shame reported by Mongolian herders against the devaluation expressed by the Shuar in the Ecuadorian Amazon, you observe a very strong positive relationship. The more the Shuar devalue you, if you take a given action or you show a given personal characteristic that is disgraceful, the more the Mongolian people report shame if those things were true of themselves. Now, does this absolutely prove human nature and rule out cultural diffusion or convergent cultural evolution? If you put a gun to my head, I'm not going to risk my life, and I don't know, I cannot 100% rule out the possibility that the Mongolians learn about Shuar values or some values, third-party values that also affected the Shuar. But it seems to me that the evidence is more consistent with the human nature theory than the cultural evolution theory. In addition, we measure pairwise measures of cultural similarity across these 15 small-scale societies. We have measures of geographic proximity and linguistic similarity and religious similarity. And the question is it the case that the more culturally similar two societies are, the more similar they are in shame, in devaluation, or in the shame-devaluation link? And we found no effect that that's the case. All of these things fail to account for between community similarities in shame devolution or their associate or shame devolution. So this suggests that this may be the answer, although again, I don't think we can absolutely disprove the cultural evolution theory. Okay, moving on to pride. The theory here is the cousin theory of shame. You not only need to defeat the fear of being devalued by others, you also need to harvest and cultivate positive valuation from others. So that gives us a theory of pride. And when we are proudful, we do like this, we say yay, and we advertise our successes. That's a lot of work by Jess Tracy on the display of pride. And so the theory of pride is not only the display, but also the internal computations of what happens when you achieve. And so similarly, the theory here is that the anticipatory feeling of pride may be a guidance system that guides you to achieve things that other people value in your local milieu. And that's good because you harvest positive valuation from others. But at the same time, I mean, if other people value athleticism, the anticipatory pride may propel you to go to the gym and cultivate some athleticism. But on the other hand, it's not good to spend 24 hours doing gym because there's decreasing marginal returns to doing gym activities. And so there's a just right in pride too. So the anticipatory feeling of pride that you feel as you're considering whether or not to take an action that other people might value, going to the gym or studying more anthropology or becoming more physically attractive or what have you, learn a second language or whatever, the internal anticipatory feeling of pride should be intense enough to motivate actions that are socially valued, but it should not be so intense that those actions are over pursued, of course, and also or over advertised. If you over advertise and you act bigger than your britches, people don't like it, that's a reason for devaluation. So the pride system in prospect should act just right. Goldilocks rule again. And we run similar design in 16 industrial societies with between subjects design, but instead of negative events, these are positive events, competence, generosity, etc., 25 different hypothetical situations. And in each of these 16 societies, we find very strong positive correlations. The more a given action or trait is positively valued by an audience in a given culture, the more that action or trait elicits anticipatory pride in the individual if that action or trait was true of the individual himself or herself. That's true in 16 industrial societies, including societies from East Asia, communal, such as Japan and South Korea and Turkey. Turkey is not East Asia, but and there's a footnote there regarding the Heine Norenzayan theory of East Asian people. Communal people don't have self-enhancement. And this theory suggests that the strong version of the lack of self-enhancement in East Asia is probably not true, because otherwise, how could you explain that the Japanese and the South Koreans, with their pride, the anticipatory pride at least, they track not only the values of their fellow Japanese and Korean, but also they track the values, if you correlate the pride of the Japanese or the Korean against the positive valuations of American or British audiences, you see positive correlations across the board. So the strong version of the lack of self-enhancement in East Asia is probably not true. Maybe weaker versions, maybe more workable. Okay, and similarly, you see these things. Pride is specifically tuned to local audiences. It's specifically pride that tracks audience valuations and not just any all positive emotion and so on. And these I replicated in 10 small-scale societies around the world, and we see in each of these 10 small-scale societies, pride positively tracks the positive values conferred by audiences between subjects design. Okay, so this led to a number of papers on on industrial societies on shame and pride, and also in small-scale societies. And okay, these data suggest then that so-called self-conscious emotions, shame, pride, guilt, I haven't talked about guilt, but at least shame and pride are other focused. They are machines that guide your own behavior so that you can harvest positive valuation from others or minimize the threat of devaluation from others. And several people have argued that these emotions are other focused, Dan Fessler and Paul Gilbert and myself and others. But I know that there is an alternative theory very prominent in social psychology to the extent that no, these self-conscious emotions are very much self-focused, and they have nothing, if they have anything to do with how other people view you, that's an epiphenomenon. We have additional work in the works more directly assessing these, pitting these competing theories. Okay. So after working on shame and pride, I've done work on other social emotions. Can we see the emotion valuation nexus or relation link in other emotions? And the answer is yes. And so I want to point your attention to this phenomenon or this aspect of emotional valuation. It has to do with their syntax like in this process, I believe. So consider the claim or the fact that I'm athletic. I'm not actually myself athletic, but it's a counterfactual. So I'm athletic. That has some degree of value in the local ecology. So that means Americans or the Angelinos may attach positive, perhaps, value on those people who are athletic in Los Angeles. Okay. In addition to that, you may embed this situation or fact or state of affairs in a broader event, which may be a broader social event. For example, it's true that I'm athletic, and that is an input to the pride system. If it's true that Daniel is athletic, I will feel pride. Oklahomans also like athletic people. If I'm athletic, I have pride. On the other hand, you may embed this into a broader proposition that is the input of gratitude. So for example, if I'm not really athletic, but I have a friend who convinces some third person that I'm athletic, even though I'm not really athletic, I may feel grateful toward my friend for convincing them that I'm athletic. So that's a gratitude input. And reciprocally, if I'm actually athletic and a friend of mine disregards or doesn't acknowledge the fact that I'm awesomely athletic and treats me with a respect that is calibrated to, that is owed to someone who's not athletic, I may feel anger. So that's an input of anger. So you see that you may get embeddingness here and constituents like in language. And so, okay, the pride input will trigger the pride machine and produce the constellation of actions that are pride. The gratitude inputs will trigger the gratitude machine and deliver the thanks and the recalibration of how much you value the other and so on. The anger will produce the anger constellation. Okay. However, it could be that even though all of these situations trigger different emotions, the embedded situation that is the athleticism is, as a first approximation, valued the same across all these events, no matter what specific emotion they trigger. Why? Well, because by hypothesis, the value attached to athleticism or to someone who is athletic in this local ecology is one and the same, no matter what that thing is embedded into. And so the value of athleticism would be here represented in the center as the value that the grammar of social valuation imputes to people who are athletic, everything else equal. Okay, so here we did a rough and dirty first pass proof of concept experiment and the data suggests that that's how it works. So very similar paradigm, and what this means is that everything is between, all of these 6 cells are between subjects, and each of these 6 groups of people are shown 25 positive situations, and they're asked various things. Here, how much anger would you feel, how much pride would you feel, and so on for each of these. To put it in simple English, the more these are data from the United States, the more American people from MTurk, they attach positive value to someone else if that someone else was X, where X is something positive, athletic, generous, skillful, blah, blah, blah. The more pride you feel if this was true of you, the more anger you feel if this was true of you and your friend didn't acknowledge this, the more gratitude you feel if your friend convinced someone else that this is true of you when it's not really true of you, and so on. And these are data from India. I see positive correlations everywhere. And you can predict many different emotions in India from the social values that Americans impute to these things. And reciprocally, you can predict American emotions from Indian values. All right. That's the paper here. We call it the emotion valuation constellation or nexus. And then the next step was similar paradigm, now looking at, instead of valuation predicting different emotional feelings, valuation predicting different outputs of a given emotion. So here in the center, we are constellating devaluation for each of 25 negative traits. Here in the center is how much people devalue someone else if each of those 25 things are true of the someone else. And here in each of the outward boxes are the ratings of how much you would, okay, if each of these 25 negative things were true of you, how much would you want to lie to others so that they believe that that's not true of you? How much would you want to destroy evidence so that other people believe that that's not true of you? If someone saw that this is true of you, how much would you want to threaten them so to prevent them from communicating to third parties that this is true of you, the shame feeling, hiding, and so on. And the negative value attached to these traits predict multiple different outputs of the emotion of shame. This is in America, this is in India, and you can predict outputs in America and India from the values imputed by people in the other culture. And we've done this with emotion of shame, with emotion of pride. Here's the outputs of pride and the outputs of anger. And I have to note that these are hypothetical behavioral outputs. There's a literature on response coherence, which is a big deal in emotion science. There's a big debate in emotion science whether emotions are, there's many debates, but one important debate is whether emotions are real machines in the head versus things that are constructed culturally, but not really mechanistically in the head. And one argument is that observed coherence in the way different physiological, behavioral, motivational outputs go up or down in lockstep with one another has been inconsistent across outputs. And so some people argue that because all of these outputs, instead of going in lockstep the way an Ekman or someone else might argue, because coherence is inconsistent across outputs, then emotions don't really exist. And there's other reasons. And so here I note that the particular outputs that I measured are hypothetical and behavioral, and they tend to produce coherence in the literature. So I'm going to default to the proverbial more research is needed to find whether other outputs cohere. But anyway, that's a brief note to make here. Okay. All right. So there's data showing associations between emotion and social valuation across cultures and in a way that might serve an adaptive function. And this emotion valuation nexus is something that presumably evolved to regulate interpersonal relationships. You feel anger if someone mistreats you, to bargain for better treatment from the other. You feel shame if someone sees that you stole something or you lied. You hide, you avoid their negative reactions. The next question here is could it be that this emotion valuation nexus, which the locus of which is interpersonal, could it be at the root of institutions, society-wide institutions? So let me give you the specific way that we approach this question. The specific question that we ask here is, can lay people intuitively recreate the criminal laws of culturally unfamiliar societies? There's quite a bit of research showing that lay people with no training in law, if you show them offenses taken from legal codes from known culturally familiar societies, they give ratings of moral wrongness for each offense in a way that agrees with the actual punishments dictated by those culturally familiar legal codes, for example, legal codes from the United States. And again, that has been taken by some, Rob Kurtzman and Owen Jones and other people, to mean that perhaps the origins of criminal laws and justice is human nature. And other people have argued, well, that justice-making institutions are hugely variable across societies. Justice intuitions and laws are highly variable. So in societies across space and time, things such as selling alcohol and polygamy and homosexuality are punished and deemed immoral in some cultures or times, and they're not punished and they're not seen as immoral in other times or places. And so the question here is, can lay people intuitively recreate the criminal laws of culturally unfamiliar societies? And this would disambiguate that existing evidence. Okay. And the answer to this question is yes, if the emotion valuation nexus steers the legal thinking of lawmakers, and if the emotion valuation nexus is a human universal shared by lay people and lawmakers around the world throughout history. So here we purposefully try to get criminal laws from highly unfamiliar cultures. Again, if lay people can intuitively recreate criminal laws from the United States, that is consistent with human nature, but that's also consistent with American lay people being culturally familiar with the social norms that American lawmakers deploy, or the knowledge of the cultural norms that American lawmakers deploy when they make laws. So that finding doesn't disambiguate between human nature and social norm familiarity. So here, by grabbing norms or laws that are highly culturally unfamiliar, we make a strong test of the theory. If lay people who are highly culturally unfamiliar with these societies nevertheless can intuitively recreate in some minimal, at least some minimal skeletal way, these criminal laws, then that would be evidence for the human nature origin of the emotion valuation nexus, and also the emotion valuation nexus organizing lawmaking institutions to some extent, not the entirety. Okay, so time code, China, 1400 years before present, And the laws of Eshnuna, these are a cousin of the famous Hammurabi Code, a few hundred years older. And these are some of the most ancient criminal laws that exist, period, in humanity, as far as archaeology can tell us. Mesopotamia, 3,800 years old. And these laws are beautiful in the sense that they have been translated, and this scripture has been decoded and translated to English. And they're beautiful because of the you can read these laws and you can get into the mind almost of the lawmakers. And they're also beautiful because methodologically beautiful in the sense that they are the laws of Eshnuna, they're punished in a singular metric, which is helpful to do the kind of things that we want to do correlated with modern intuitions. There's other codes from non-familiar societies that punish offenses in very different metrics: decapitation, burning, scalping, and that's great. But I mean, not for the people who are scalped, of course, but that doesn't allow the harmonization of metrics. So here we have singular metrics. Okay, so here's Dadusha, the Eshnuna king that we believe formulated the laws of Eshnuna. And here's a modern participant in our studies. And the hypothesis is that these two people had human brains and also machinery for attaching social value to other people, and the emotion, valuation, constellation, and that Dadusha formulated his laws of Eshnuna using this machinery. The minimalist claim is the way Dadusha formulated how much you should pay if you were paid 1 shekel of silver to harvest and you fail to harvest and you have to pay 10 shekels of silver. That very highly contingent, locally, culturally contingent law is ultimately generated by a grammar of social valuation that has universal innate principle for computing social value, but also, of course, local open parameters open to local information, local ecology. Okay, and if that's how Dadusha formulated his laws of Eshnuna with the emotion valuation constellation, and there's enough innate cross-cultural universal content in this constellation, then a modern participant from the United States 4,000 years later may intuitively recreate these laws, at least minimally, simply because they're humans. She didn't have to go to Harvard Law or anything like that. Just by virtue of being human, she would generate something like the laws of Eshnuna. That's the claim. That's very simple form of the hypothesis. And so here the scatter plots are very small, but the answer is that yes. So here's the time code, and here on the x-axis are the copper chin, the fine, the monetary fine that the time code assesses if you engage in each of 30 offenses. So these are offenses that are cheap, you have to pay little, and here are offenses that you have to pay a lot. And some of these offenses, they have punishments in penal servitude and killing and lashes and stuff like that, but they're redeemable for copper chin. So we translated everything to this one metric of copper chin, the fine. And here on the y-axis is the, I think that's the, what is this? Shame. So we start with shame, the emotion of shame. On the y-axis is the shame from 0 to 100 that Indian participants, Indian Turkers and US Turkers express for each of these 30 offenses. And there's positive correlations. The more the Tang bureaucrats punished a given offense in the currencies of copper chin, the more American and Indian Turkers would feel shame if these things were true of themselves. This is also true for the Eshnuna laws, these very ancient laws. And this is a replication of what other people have done with culturally familiar laws from the United States. People can track these things. And that's true for shame, and that's true for devaluing a neighbor, someone else interpersonally. They did this. the moral wrongness that you impute to an action. We had people mock legislate how much fines you would assess if you were a lawmaker, how much time in prison, everything correlates across the board. It's important to note that there's not everything is a cultural concordance. There's very important and glaring whooping cultural discordances. So some things such as killing your slave for no reason, those things were punished lightly, relatively lightly by the Tang Code, for example, but very harshly by American and Indian participants. So perhaps the proposal is that a hybrid architecture with innate principle and open parameter, the invariant principles can account for why American and modern American and Indian people saw eye to eye with the Tang bureaucrats, and the open parameters may explain the cultural differences across societies. And methodological note, we took care to exclude from analysis any subject who had any training in the law, or at the end of the experiment, we asked people guess where the offenses that you read about were taken from, and if the subjects made a correct guess, we pay them to incentivize true responses, accurate responses, but we exclude them from analysis because here the claim is, or we wanted to know if people who are ignorant from the standpoint of explicit knowledge of the law or the specific laws were nevertheless able to intuitively recreate these laws, and the answer is yes, to some extent they can. Okay, so let's, this is the paper, recent paper with Carlton Patrick. Okay. All right. Social emotion and social valuation, value computation. So I've talked about social emotions, social valuation, and what about value in general, the value of anything and everything? Okay, so it's useful to know the value of things, the value of good things, the value of bad things. It's useful to know the value of food, as behavioral ecologists here know, and anthropologists know. For example, you might be willing to trek 2 miles to a target location and 2 miles back and spend 400 calories. If you know that in that target location, there's a honeycomb full of honey worth 1,000 calories, but you may not trek 4 miles to get a blueberry worth 1 calorie. So knowing the value of foods is useful to forage efficiently, for example. Knowing the value of food is also useful for many other things, including, for example, knowing the value of social partners. So in small-scale societies, people attach more respect and deference to individuals who are capable food producers. And in addition, the value of food may inform the activation of different emotions. So if you're out of luck and you're out of a job and someone gives you food, you may feel gratitude. And not only that, but the gratitude that you may feel may be calibrated to the amount of calories or nutrients that the other person gives you. And on the other hand, if someone steals food from you, you may feel anger at them, and more anger with the with more nutrient content that they are taking from you. Okay. So there's 2 hypotheses that I'm testing in this study regarding features that a brain may need to be equipped with in order to value things appropriately. One is accuracy in the imputation of value, and the second one is integration, how values are integrated into different systems. So hypothesis number 1 is that people can accurately intuit the nutrient content of food items, and hypothesis 2 is that the brain rationally integrates the subjective food value imputed to a food item with the social value of people who can acquire that food item with social emotions relevant to that food item. So the method is pre-registered here. We ask people, I ask people about 40 different food items, things such as blueberry, tomato, onion, cheeseburger, bacon, rice and beans, and so on. We have turkers. Within subjects, I ask for each of the 40 food items, I ask the relevant questions. And there are 6 between subjects conditions in which I ask for each of these 40 things, how much food value, how much enjoyment would you get if you ate each of these things? How positively would you view someone else if they were capable of harvesting or producing this food item? How much gratitude if someone gave you this food item? Anger if someone took that food item from you? Shame if you were seen stealing that food item? Pride if you were able to produce that food item to give to your child for lunch or something. Okay, so result number 1, participants accurately intuited the nutrient content of food items. There's positive correlations between the subjective food value that people impute to the different foods and the energy, protein, total lipid content of the and if you put all these things in a regression, then so this regression table here shows that in the full model, the more you subjectively say that you would enjoy eating food item X, the more carbohydrate that food item has and the more protein that food item has. So there's something in your, this is again hypothetical, but there's something that happens in the brain such that your feeling of enjoyment, anticipatory feeling of enjoyment, tracks nutrient contents of the food as it should, maybe. This is the social value imputed to other people as a function of all these nutrients. All of these things are tracked at the 0 order, and in the full model, carbohydrate and protein wins. I don't want to make a strong claim that lipid is not important. There's stories on lipid and other nutrients that may be very important, but this is a first pass. This is an emotional pride. How much pride would you feel if you were able to collect these things? Again, it tracks carbohydrates and proteins. So you may one tagline of this may be that social feelings and social emotions are not just fluffy, fuzzy, feely thing. They are fuzzy feeling things, but they track fitness properties of the objects outside people and non-people, food, for example. Okay, and result number 2, the rational integration of value and emotion. The more subjective food value people impute to different foods, the more everything. The more anger they feel if that food item was stolen from them, the more social value they attach to someone else if they're capable of harvesting that food item, the more shame they feel if they were seen stealing that food item from others, and so on. So it's pretty much the same method you see in the shamed evaluation original study applied to a broad number of things over and over and over. It's a very simple method, and I think, well, anyway, that's what you're saying here. Bats, it's important to calculate the value of good things and also bad things. So in this study, it's a very similar paradigm, but now with 28 diseases and injuries: a hip fracture, an eye puncture wound, a hand laceration wound, malaria, leprosy, flu, and so on. And here, how negative it would be for yourself if you had this injury or disease. That's a subjective disease or injury value. Social value attached to someone who can cure this injury or disease. Gratitude if someone else cured that disease and you had it. Anger if someone caused that disease or injury to you. Shame if you caused someone else. Pride if you were able to cure that in someone else. And here, I couldn't find objective measures of fitness cause of having all of these things. So here I'm going to present only the integration results. But then basically, again, the more negative people think it is for themselves to have each of these 28 things, the more they would feel anger if someone else gave it to them, and so on. Okay, so it seems perhaps there's some evidence consistent with the idea that the brain computes value the value of things, and value information structures have many interesting properties, two of which are, one, it reaches out with a hand, so to speak, to the real world, and it grabs the true value of things. And the true value is not an objective property, it's at the intersection of the actual nutrient content of the thing, plus the specific evolutionary biology of the organism. Poop is bad for us, but it's good for dung beetles. Okay, so but it reaches outside and it computes accurately the fitness affordances for the organism, and that's accuracy. And as far as transmission or integration, value needs to be internally broadcast or transmitted somehow, and to all the mechanisms that ancestrally would have benefited from acquiring and using value information. So this information needs to travel in the brain and be bound to the right variables and produce copies or some information within these mechanisms that are proportional to the original value computed at the source, and organize the activation of emotion and social status difference and whatever social enjoyment or food enjoyment in proportion to the value of food, and similarly with disease and resolution. Okay, so it's integration, and this is the preprint on accuracy and integration in value computation. And to finalize, okay, so human value project. The bigger project here is to do what Schwartz and Hofstede and the other people have done, but not just descriptively. They have done a lot of the descriptive parts, and many others, anthropologists and a ton of other people have documented things that people value. It's not just Schwartz and Hofstede and Roquea. So there's an very important descriptive part, which is to catalog, manifest human values, things that people value. Again, not only big value, communalism and individualism, but also water, obsidian, and gold, money, shark fins, and whatever. Their distribution in space and time across ecologies, genders, cultures, lifespan, everything. But more interesting to me, in addition to just the description, although description is a very important first step, to explain how the brain computes value in the first place, how, where, and why value information is generated and routed internally, and map out the developmental, computational, algorithmic, and physical realization of value computation in the brain. I call that the Human Value Project. I have a number of projects working on this. Okay, so to finalize, I've talked about accuracy and integration in value computation. There's a ton more features that I think need to happen for the brain to value appropriately. Another one, just to give a couple easy ones, what to attach value to. There's a problem of scene parsing, which is not, it is obvious if you have the machinery. It's not obvious at all if you don't have the machinery. So we need to explain this. So you walk into your kitchen and you see an apple and a poisonous insect, and the apple is positive value, the poisonous insect is negative value. So what's the value in the scene? What is the value of that? Well, it could be zero value, but it's not zero value in retrospect if you can eat the apple and avoid the insect. So how you segment scenes and what you attach value to is not an obvious problem. The brain needs to do that, and there has to be design features for doing that. Content specificity, Lida Cosmis always says that there's a ton of work in evolutionary psychology and allied disciplines on content specificity, domain specificity in value computation. All the literature on mate value and friend value and WTR as a function of how much they help you, and the problematic value of toxins for pregnant women, and on and on and on and on and on. all of that literature, I take that to be literature on the content specificity in value computation. The attributes and variables and elements that afford value in the domain of food are very different from the things that afford value in the domain of social interactions. Data says that if you valued mates the way you value chocolates, you would mate with a chocolate bar, and you would mate your you would eat your partner and mate with a chocolate bar. That's not good. So there's a lot of massive amounts of content specificity in value computation. But I think that in addition to this domain of content specificity, there's domain specificity, but content generality. There's a ton of design features that cut across domains in value computation. And okay, there's a 1,000 gazillion more. Okay, and I'm done. Thank my collaborators and funding and you for your attention. And I'll be happy to take questions if there's questions.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Let me know if you want me to leave the slides or shift to normal mode or.
It's up to you. I think maybe leaving the slides could be useful for
Sure.
Addressing anyone's questions, perhaps, that come up. So yeah, that's a good one to land on. So thank you very much for that wide-ranging presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm just going to sit and wait for folks to make their questions known in the chat. So if you do have a question, please.
Joe.
Thanks, Daniel. A wonderful talk. My question is about how for this human valuome project, how you plan to deal with, well, sort of, disagreements about value. I was thinking about this with regard to Bitcoin. I was talking with my nephew the other day, and he's investing in Bitcoin, and I can understand the principle behind cryptocurrencies, but I don't really trust the implementation, and seems to me like, Dutch tulips, someday everyone could just decide that Bitcoin is worthless. And so here, we have, we live in the same country and speak the same language, but have very different ideas about the value of something. And like, is this, are you going to integrate into this project ideas about, the transmission of ideas about what has value or what?
Okay. Okay, there's a thousand things to say. I don't know what to say about that. The general feeling I have is that there's a ton of work or arguments to the extent that judgment, decision making, humans are dumb. We're full of dumb heuristics, and value is in error, and there's biases and this and that. And sure. And there's disagreement in value, and there's different sorts of disagreements. You can have a theory of why there's noise, and then there's principal disagreement, and you can have theories of all of those things. But I think there's I think I don't want to be too blunt, but the issue of error and disagreement and bias, and I find that very interesting and important. I find the principal disagreement more interesting than the mere noise, but I think there's a huge, massive iceberg hidden under the surface of extremely obvious or fundamental properties or design features for the very basic value computation for anything, the most banal and mundane and boring and stupefyingly boring things in value. Okay, I like the apple. Okay, like stupefyingly that it's not sexy, it's no bias, it's no anomaly in economics. Yeah, okay, nothing. But they are astoundingly complex when you think about the computational requirements to compute the value of those things. So maybe it's a bias of my way of thinking right now, that all the bias thing, I am biased to not care about the biases. And I don't care at all. I just want to know the most boring, stupefyingly boring things, because I think we don't know those basic things. We know a lot, and neuroscientists have done a lot of work, and many other people have done extremely important work. So we know many things, but I want to know the basics, and then the sexy things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I find the stupefyingly obvious very sexy, but not everyone agrees, but whatever. Yeah. Jeff?
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And brilliant talk, really interesting research. I've got two questions. One's quick, only because I'm guessing I'm misunderstanding the research a little bit. But it seemed like the positive emotions, such as pride, were accounting for more of the variance than the negative ones. Shame as an example. Am I reading that correctly? And
Yeah, you did. Yes.
Okay. Got it.
I have no idea what that's about.
I think,
and I had the same question, and I think to give an intelligent answer to that, I think the proverbial more research would be needed. I don't have really a good story for that. So maybe, yeah. There were more items used in some of the research of positive items than negative items. So that in part it could be that. So I don't think at this stage we can take that very seriously, but it might be something, it might not be something. I don't know. Yeah,
it could be a difference between positive and negative reinforcement as well.
Do you have thoughts on that?
No, I was hoping you did. Yeah, I mean, look, we know that positive reinforcement in learning and behavior on the developmental side performs better than the negative reinforcement or punishment. So it could be that as the brain is operating, looking at value systems, it could just be replicating that. It could be that simple. You could also make the argument for the opposite. There's heuristics and biases research. You've got losses looming larger than gains. So I could have seen the opposite happen as well. So
yes,
like you, not sure, and probably needs more research. Second question is whether you've studied the neural mechanics at all, the mechanisms behind this, because this seems like it screams like a good explanation for the evolutionary benefits and adaptive response that created mirror neurons, in particular.
Okay. So I don't work on the neural part of this. There is work on neuroeconomics of value. There's a lot of very good work, I think. I am working more at the computational functional level of MAR description. And I think that all of these perspectives, implementational, algorithmic, and computational, I think they need to be integrated, and they can and should be profitably integrated. I think the computational functional level is particularly appealing to me because I think that each has its own strengths and whatnot, but I think that there's many features and requirements that need to happen for people to value things the human way, that I think computation is a royal avenue for this. And to give you an example of the way I'm thinking about this, there's work on common currency of neural value computation by Rangel and Glimcher and other people. I think that work is brilliant, but I think that's not necessarily the last word on value computation, because you could produce theoretically, in principle, theories of when there should be common currencies of value computation and when there shouldn't be, depending on adaptive problem. And you may be able to formulate general functional requirements for value computation, given what we know about ancestral and modern humans, and work from there. And of course, neural implementation at some point is going to be important, but there may be forms of value computation that don't rely on those neurons, or even on the brain at all, or on the central nervous system, or even the brain. And so I don't want to necessarily time myself to the neurons. I want to think about value computation as a biological problem and work from there.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Dan? Yeah.
I think Gabriel had his hand up first.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Gabriel.
Hello. So you're showing. I enjoyed the talk, especially all the comparative stuff and how you tested things in so many societies. Your aim seems to be to understand commensuration, but I'm wondering about what about cases where people resist commensuration at all, right? Not how do I compare a ratio of value between A and B, but how do I say, I just don't want to commensurate A and B at all. So for instance, you had this example of legal codes, but there's some legal codes that say you simply can't commensurate this, right? So numbers 3531 specifically says you can't handle murder with a wrongful death suit. You have to handle it with a blood vendetta. So that would be an example of an ancient legal code that says you can't commensurate, right? I mean, the kind of thing that you see in these things, you know, and there's plenty of legal codes, as you point out, that say, you know, this is the standard wrongful death settlement for a high status person, a low status person, all that sort of thing. But there's other people who say, no, you just can't do that. You just got to kill the guy.
Okay. Okay. Brilliant. That was a big problem for us because we want to do I want to do everything. We got reviewers saying, okay, so you show these extremely exotic things, exotic in the sense of extremely ancient, and then they say, well, but it's just two. I mean, whatever. What does it even mean? Well, you first establish these, okay, but we want now. I'd like to sample every possible code, but we can't because the Aztec. I wanted Amerindian, and that doesn't work. So there's many things to say there. I don't know that the vendetta and I don't know that that's not commensuration. That's a different form of proportionality. It's lack of single metric, but there is a rationality in how things. So it could be that the brain is perfectly rational in the economic sense, in the technical sense, in the sense that it's imputing 100% accurate, 100% accurate and consistent the values of these things. It's just that it's delivering in, for whatever reason, different metrics that we can't. So I had collaborators say, well, impute some big number of economics. No, I don't want to, because what the hell do I know? So methodologically, I can't do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's no commensuration. But then there's other issues with the issue that you raise, and if you have thoughts on that, I'd like to hear them.
Well, I mean, I was thinking of it in Fisk's terminology, who unfortunately doesn't seem to be on the call. You know, you're basically taking things in terms of market pricing, where you can have ratios of values along a common unit of account. You know, but there's other relational models besides that. And, you know, the Bible's model for murder seems to be what Fisk would call quality matching. And, you know, where it's tit for tat, but that's not exactly the same thing as saying, here's this common unit of account by which we can have a common ratio of value.
Yes.
So I don't know. I think if you were to do this, if you were to try and implement this experiment, one way would be to say, to ask the subjects, which of these things do you think are commensurable? You know, to say, which of these things do you think could be settled with a fine or a lawsuit in this, you know, ancient unknown law code, versus which one do you think, you know, there's some punishment or some means of redress, but it's not expressible as a fine?
Yes. Yes. So the thing you raise, there's, to what extent do you think this is a crime between two people versus a crime against the community that needs to be redressed? And there's questions like the ones you're raising that are very fundamental. And yes, I agree.
Well, it's not just a community, right? I mean, the concept of a vendetta, I mean, in modern law, we think of criminal law as a crime against the state, and a tort as a crime against another citizen. But in ancient law, a vendetta was still a crime against another person, even though it was a criminal offense. It was just one that had to be met violence with violence. But that's definitely on the right track, right? You could ask some, you'd want to pretest and everything like that, but you could definitely ask some version of, do you think this offense in this culture would be understood as something to be settled essentially as a tort, or in monetary terms, or some other way?
I like that. Thank you.
Of course.
Dan?
Hi, Daniel. I'm sorry that you're not well. One certainly couldn't tell from your very lucid presentation. I hope you feel better soon. So you and I agree on quite a lot of things, but it's much more interesting to talk about the points of disagreement than the points of agreement. First, kudos for the expansion to a truly cross-cultural set of projects. I think it greatly enhances the evidentiary value of your findings, but I want to take issue with the dichotomy that you posed. So, you somewhat modestly said, well, if you put a gun to my head, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the Mongolian herders, learned through social transmission the Shuar values, right? And this is equating cultural evolution and cultural diffusion, and those two things are not synonymous at all. So, if we were to study tool technology and we found that knives all over the world had the same basic features, they had handles that were similarly sized, and the circumference of the handle was similar, and the length of the blade was approximately the same, and the features were all pretty uniform across a wide variety of different societies. The two hypotheses on the table are not, well, there's a template in the head for making knives. That is, this is evoked culture, which is essentially what you're arguing when you say things like shame knows what is wrong in another culture. That is evoked culture. You're claiming that, that the American M-Turkers can predict the Indians' responses because they know the same things, as it were, because it's innate, right? But the alternative is not that the information is diffused. The alternative is that cultural evolution has created the same things over and over again, because that's a good way to make a knife. That is, there's a basic way to run a society. You can't have people just stealing from each other. You reward people for cooperating with each other. You can't have people just killing their neighbors. Those cause problems. And if you don't solve those problems, then either your society goes, extinct, or it gets swallowed up by a neighboring society that does a better job of solving the problems. And you let that system run for 300,000 years, and you end up with, considerable uniformity about some elementary things like murder and theft and so on, right? Through cultural evolution, not through cultural diffusion. And I don't see anything in the results that you've presented that in any way argue for innateness in that regard.
Sure. Yes, that's why I said, if you put a gun to my head, I'm not gonna swear for the innateness. I was thinking there's a third one, or there's many more, but there's another one, which is that the open parameters are similar across societies, and that wouldn't be open ecological parameters that are not cultural in the way that you are referring to culture. But yes, it could be. It could be. So do you have thoughts on?
Yeah. I mean, I think following the knife analogy, the greater the extent to which the rules at issue are fundamental to structuring any ordered society, the more universal they will be. The more that they are fundamental to structuring larger scales, the more common they will be in large-scale societies, and the less common they will be in small-scale societies. And the less fundamental they are to ordering social relationships, the more parochial they will be. So when you do your shame studies or your pride studies, you don't ask people, how angry would you be if someone said that you ate fish on Friday, right? Or that you had beef or pork, or didn't fast, or whatever it is, because those are not fundamental rules for structuring a society.
Right. So we had studies with those type of rules, and we showed that in that case, then shame tracks much more the local system than the foreign system, as it should.
So how can you conclude from that that shame knows what is universal? It seems to me that shame doesn't know anything at all. What shame is good at doing is motivating behavior that is in accord with local norms. And local norms are universal when they reflect the basic architecture of how to run a society, and they're parochial when they don't.
I think there's problems with the so I am sympathetic to your counter, but I think the concept of norm is problematic because it is empty and it is tautological. If you look for definitions of norms in the literature, you see that the definitions of norms, what they have in common over and over is that they're normative. And so it's intuitive that to say that a norm is normative, but it's like the Moliere imaginary, or I don't know which play, the virtus normativa theory of norms. I think that norm definitions are empty and tautological because they have to average across a huge number of domains that are normative, but have logics of what things are prescribed or prescribed that are completely different and for different reasons. So you don't sleep with your sister because there's a norm against sleeping with close relatives because of the inbreeding depression. And that's a causal theory of why we don't do it. And there's a social taboo and there's a norm. And there's a norm of cooperate with the David Lieberman study. So I think we have to meet somewhere. And I agree that there's cultural alternatives along the lines that you're describing. But I think there's issues there too. But yeah. But yeah, I'm not saying the shame system innately knows everything. The machine needs to be calibrated with information, like anything, nature, nurture. But I think, yeah.
So the semantics of the concept of norm aside, I've put on the table a very straightforward possibility that you can pursue, which is that rules, call them rules instead of norms, and you avoid the tautology, right? A rule is whatever people say the rule is. Rules that are widely shared and about which people have considerable agreement across cultures and that their emotions will track per your very nice work on the subject are rules that are fundamental to structuring social groups. Those will be the most universal. The next most universal will be those that allow the scaling up of the size of the group. And those will be common in large scale societies, but not in small scale societies. And the most parochial will be those that essentially are the most open parameter in your sense. So they signal something, membership in the group, fidelity to some set of local values, right? But they're arbitrary in their content. You could reanalyze all of the examples that you've used, and we need not involve guns at all. In fact, we can just say, let's put an apple on the table as the bet, right? And I will buy you an apple if it turns out that I'm wrong.
Okay, I'd love to chat with you more, maybe. I don't know if we have time to chat now. I'll be happy to chat now or later. Or
yeah, we should.
Sure, I'll take your apple bet, or we can share enough.
And what is the true value of that apple, I wonder. So that's a great conversation that we've just had after your talk, and I think we can continue this conversation. I don't presume to speak for Dan and his schedule, but what we can do now is just bring to a close the public section of this Beck talk, and just thank you again, Daniel, for your wonderful kickoff to our winter quarter Beck talks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.